So that's the body completely stripped of parts. Now we'll move on to the neck. We're going to start by taking off the locking mechanism, the truss cover, and then we're going to tackle these tuning pegs, taking particular attention to that crack in the headstock. Unlike in a Floyd, where the tuning mechanism is a couple of Allen bolts right the way through the neck, this is just screwed onto the front of the headstock with 4 screws. So it's fairly easy to remove. Pops right off there. I can't get the nut off right now without cracking through the finish, because it seems to be finished right up the sides of the nut, so I'm going to leave that in place for the moment. But we'll try out this truss cover. So when we start on these tuning machines, there's a screw per tuning machine on the back to hold them in place, and then the nut on the tops to lock them onto the headstock. So we'll start with the screws, and then we'll move on to the nuts. Looks like this one was loose. Once you get the tuning machine off, make sure you put the nut back onto it so you don't get any of them lost. Sort of minimises the amount of pieces you need to be lying around. Now comes the moment of truth. This is the last tuning machine, and I've left it to last because of that crack in the headstock that goes all the way through there and doubles itself right the way around to the back. If this crack is only finished deep, then we shouldn't have a problem, but because it is right the way through, I suspect there is some structural problems in the wood, so if I take this tuning peg off, we may find that piece of wood will break away. Let's have a look. Looks like we're in luck with this crack in the headstock, despite it being all the way around the neck. When I'm applying pressure to that point, it doesn't seem to be opening the cracks up at all. So whatever struck the headstock hard enough to make a crack right the way around the finish, it doesn't seem to have caused particular structural integrity problems to the wood itself, which is good for us because we don't need to repair it. So let's talk about scalloping. As you can see, I've started work here with the final fret on the neck. You can see there the sort of semicircular radius cutout of the fretboard. So that is my first scallop, and I'm going to continue up the neck with this. Now, what is the advantage of scalloping? Scalloping essentially gives you the feeling of very tall frets, which means that you can bend notes a lot easier, plus you don't get hung up on the wood of the fretboard when you're playing bends and fast notes. So it's kind of a personal preference thing. But it works really well for wide bends, fast playing, and especially if you've got a light touch. Because if you press too hard, you will go out of tune. But that is a scallop, and I've started work, as you can see, not too deep. They don't need to be too deep, the scallops. So the trick now is to get the rest of them to be level with this, and I'll show you what I'm going to do right now. So for scalloping a neck, what you're going to need is a round file so that you can cut your scallops. Now, people may suggest using a Dremel or other sort of rotary tool to just sand out that quickly, but you don't get the control you need using a Dremel or a similar tool, so round file is the way to go if you want good scallops, because you can control that a lot better. A steel rule, because you want to make sure that your scallops are level. You don't want to have some of them that are lower than others, so this is to keep checking where you are as you scallop along the neck to make sure everything is in line. Of course then, sandpapers of different grits are important for getting your scallops to be nice and smooth after you've filed them down with your round file. So I've got a few different grades of sandpaper there, and I might even use some more for the final polishing, and then to get them to look nice, again with your lemon oil, if you've got a rosewood fretboard like I do here. If it's maple, don't do that. You don't want to put lemon oil on a maple fretboard. But if it's a rosewood board, definitely that to make it shine up and look as good as the rest of them. Now let me show you the procedure with the next section of fretboard here. Now you'll notice that I've not protected the fret wire at all while I'm doing this. The reason for that is these frets are going to be levelled and dressed anyway, so I'm going to be attacking these with files and sandpaper at a later date. So if a file or sandpaper touches them at this point in time, it really doesn't matter because I'm going to be fixing all these frets later anyway. So it would just be a waste of time trying to mask off all these frets. I'm going to take the round file and I want to start work, just try and get in the middle of that piece of wood and start making motions and try to keep it so that it stays straight. Usually get a wee thumbnail in there so that it keeps it true. So you can see we've started to make an impression here. The important thing I want to try and keep is the radius of the board. You can see that the board curves, it has a certain radius on top, and I want to keep the scallop to follow that curve. So that means I can't just take this straight and just file down until I eventually get to the level, because that would mean it would be deeper in the middle than it is at the outsides, and that doesn't look good and it doesn't feel good either. So I want to, as I'm doing this, make sure I'm taking off as much from the sides as I am from the middle, and this or that. So I'm going to be rocking the file as I do so, not to that extreme, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but I'm going to be trying to keep that channel nice and even. It's quite easy to see how equal you're keeping it at the start. If you're going too far in the edges, then these channels will be wider at the edges than it is in the middle, and vice versa. If you're doing too much in the middle, it'll be wider in the middle than it is at the edge. So if you can try and keep the channel nice and equal all the way along, then you're probably doing a good job. As I start to get deeper, I start to twist the file as I push it, and that pushes it towards the edges of the frets, which takes out the material that the file is missing at the moment, because the file's really running along the middle of the fretboard, so we want it to get to the close to the edges of the frets as possible. Now obviously just checking every so often that we are not going beneath the depth of the original scallop. Now the first few frets are nice and easy because they're not too much wider than the file is itself. As we get further down the fretboard to the lower frets, then we start to find that the more wood between the frets than there is at the top, so we have to use a slightly different technique to this, but for the top few frets, this is the best way to do it. So as you can see, I've had to sand back this bottom one again just to make it level with the new one I did because it was slightly deeper. The importance of measuring with the steel rule is because you can't tell from just the side dots, they might not have been installed level. And the other thing is, as you go along the neck, the depth of these is going to look slightly different. And this is one of these optical illusion things. As the frets get wider apart, the scallops will look shallower because there's a larger distance between the two edges, and it tricks our eye, whereas the ones that close together look more dramatic. So they'll look deeper. So you can't just tell by eye how deep you are. You've got to measure with the steel rule and make sure you're perfect, because if you start trying to level them by eye, you'll eventually scale yourself into the neck or scale yourself out of the neck, one of the two. So you want to keep measuring with the steel rule. So there we go, that's the first two scallops done, and I'm going to continue on with these. Now, an interesting fact about scallops and fretted instruments in general is that some of the first fretted instruments were done using a scalloping technique. Unlike on modern guitars where you see the metal fret wire placed where the notes should be to create the frets, some of the first fretted instruments used a scalloping technique. So the peaks in the wood would create the frets. So they just cut out the wood between where they wanted the notes to sit. So the frets were created by the peaks from scalloping. So yeah, this goes back to a long time before you had metal frets. Now, as you can see, this isn't a particularly quick process, so make sure if you're going to be doing this to leave yourself enough time to do it so you can do it well. You're going to take a whole day at this probably, or a few hours across a few days, so you're maybe setting yourself out for maybe 8 hours of work, especially if you're going to go right the way down to the headstock end, because those wider sections of fretboard are going to take longer to scallop. Now we come across an interesting situation, an inlay. Now, depending how deep these inlays are, we may find that we start to lose them, but hopefully not. The scallops shouldn't be so deep as to lose an inlay particularly, so we shall do our best to retain it. But you're going to find that the inlay is going to file a little bit differently from the wood, so keeping it even is going to be tricky. That's why these wide inlays are not great for doing this on. Easier if you just got dots, but hey, we'll work with what we have. These inlays are plastic. I know that because firstly it's a cheap guitar, secondly I can smell the plastic as it's being filed here, and it's coming off in sort of stringy bits. So yeah, definitely cheap plastic inlays, but that's okay because I'd rather destroy a plastic inlay than a mother of pearl one. Now I am starting to lose this inlay here because they aren't particularly deep. Which is unfortunate, but just the way the cookie crumbles, unfortunately. My scallops aren't too deep here, but obviously just starting to lose that inlay. Some of the better inlays are a little bit deeper than these plastic ones, but it really just depends on the manufacturer and what they've used. We're going to go down a little bit further on the bass side, but I think the treble side is nearly there. So that's like always a good thing to check. Check both sides, make sure that you're doing it evenly. So the bass side needs to come down a bit further. Clamp this back up, get back on with it. One thing I'm seeing from the inlay is, despite me burning through the inlay here, there's still some material underneath, some plastic material. So it looks like these are laminated and some description. It looks like they've got sort of a white plastic base under them, and then a mother of pearl styled marbled section on top to give them a more classy look. So it seems to be burning through the top layer, but there's still some plastic underneath, so we'll be able to see the fret markers regardless of that. So that's the last 4 frets scalloped. I've done a couple of necks like that before, and it's a nice little addition, just for the highest notes to bend them a little bit easier. But with this one, I'm gonna continue down a little bit further. Now as the frets are getting wider apart, I'm starting off by moving the file back and forth across the board. But as you move from side to side, you will find that you spend more time in the middle than you do at the edges, so it starts to create a natural scallop, which is your starting point for doing the whole thing. I forgot to mention at the start of this, the first step in this procedure is obviously making sure the neck is completely level, because if the neck is not straight, then you can't really line up your scallops correctly. So make sure the neck's straight before you start. I've skipped the process on a little bit for you, so you can see now everything on the upper octave of the neck has been scalloped. So that's from the 13th fret upwards, all scalloped, and that's as far as I'm going to go with this neck at the moment. I think I want to leave it at being the upper octave only scalloped. I think that's going to be an interesting little difference in feel. I've gone through each of these scallops with grades of sandpaper from 120 to 40, I think, and then up to 400, so they're nice and smooth. Hit them with some steel wool as well, just to take off all the little burrs in the wood. And there's one last thing I need to do before I finish off completely, and that is round over the edges of the binding here, because on this side they're pretty harsh, pretty sharp. I've rounded them off on this edge already, and they're nice and smooth for playing. So I'm just going to go down with the sandpaper and just roll off all these edges so that it's not a sharp edge. As you can imagine, going with the file, it creates a sharp edge on there. So just need to round that off just for feel and playability. The last thing to do with this fretboard is apply some lemon oil just to protect the wood, darken it up and make it look the same as the rest of the neck. That is the neck and those scallops finished for the moment, looking nice and shiny and beautiful as you can see. Now that's all I'm going to do with this neck for the moment. Next job will be to level and recrown all these frets, but I think that'll be a job for another day. Scalloping takes a lot out of you. So that's the end of this video. Please subscribe if you haven't, and you'll get to see more Will It Shreds soon. But for now, keep it loud, guys.